Urban guerrillas opposed to military rule in Myanmar have killed a retired senior military official. It's the latest killing in a saga of violence between the junta and those opposed to its rule. The UN's top human rights envoy to Myanmar has warned that a horrible cycle of violence is going to snowball out of control. His comments come as the military increases its attacks against pro-democracy forces and ethnic rebels in the countryside. The latest instance of which, an attack on a school in the Sagaing region in the northwest.
The Myanmar army attacked the building with helicopters. At least 11 kids were killed in the airstrike, dozens more were wounded. Witnesses say soldiers then entered the monastery and continued shooting for an hour. In the capital, Naypyidaw, the junta had a different version of the incident.
The terrorist so-called People's Defence Force and the Kachin Independence Army forced people to stay under the main building of the monastery. Then they started firing on the security forces while using the villagers as human shields. We had to shoot back.
Since the military coup in February 2021 and the brutal crackdown on non-violent mass protests, more and more people have taken up arms. Ethnic rebels have sidelined their divisions and united their forces. The exiled government has also formed an armed militia called the People's Defence Force. The fighting has been especially fierce in the northwestern Sagaing region. The military has launched several offensives in the area.
We've been fighting the military for a year now, but we don't have enough weapons. We're fighting them with homemade guns.
And after rebel attacks comes the reprisals. This village has been reduced to ashes. People are still under shock.
When the soldiers came to our village, we hid behind some shrubs. But my son was in bad health and couldn't escape. When the soldiers found him, they beat him to death. From my hiding place, I heard the sound of someone being killed.
Soldiers came to our village on their way back to their camp. There'd been no fighting around here, so they just came to destroy things. They torched 60 houses.
The military crackdown in northern Myanmar is thought to have killed 2,300 people and forced more than 500,000 from their villages, a human cost that keeps mounting.
And I spoke to a former UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, Yang Hae Lee. I asked her how bad she thinks the violence could become, given the recent comments by her successor, Thomas Andrews, that it threatened to spiral out of control.
The vicious cycle has begun long before. It began already when I was a Special Rapporteur, and this was from 2014, right before we had the Rohingya genocide. And I had already said that this situation will go beyond the borders of Myanmar into the region and then into the world. Well, now the situation is very similar. The military is conducting the same kind of behavior that they had demonstrated during the Rohingya genocide period, but throughout all of Myanmar. And so the current situation is going to get even worse, where the humanitarian crisis is no longer a crisis, it's a catastrophe caused by a human rights crisis. It was caused actually by the abuse and violations of human rights.
Now, one of the key things that Mr. Andrews also talked about was a lack of a coordinated international response to the situation. Why do you think we are seeing this lack of coordination?
That's what I've been puzzled with all these years. I guess because it's not in the backyards of Europe or in the northern American continent, or I don't know. Or maybe it's because there is so much vested interest economically in Myanmar and with the military, who has held power for over 6 decades, and they have all the rights to the natural resources and the major economy. And so maybe that could be the reason why this is happening.
There's been a key demand from many NGOs. They've been talking about implementing an arms embargo on Myanmar because there are still many countries that are sending weapons to Myanmar. And there's also been talk of sanctioning the oil and gas industries that make money for the military. Why aren't we seeing action here when we are quite certain that this would potentially hurt the military?
Absolutely. I'm really surprised that there is not a universal arms embargo. The Security Council hasn't adopted this resolution. They haven't adopted any resolution on Myanmar recently. My folks, my colleagues, we at the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar have been calling for 3 cuts. Cut the weapons, cut the cash flow, and cut the impunity. And if you cut the cash flow, and the cash flow is through these major conglomerates, oil and gas, natural resources, and we also have the arms. If you cut the arms flow, and there's been a total immunity against the perpetrators.
Well, hopefully that changes in the future, but we'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ms. Yang Healy, former UN Special. Please go ahead.
May I just add one more thing? That the major UN agencies have been signing MOUs with the military junta, which I think is not the right way to go, because there are humanitarian networks run by the ethnic resistance organizations. They know the terrain. They know, they've been doing it for decades against the military during the past 70 years. And I don't see why the international community, let alone the United Nations agencies, will not utilize and cooperate with the networks that the ethnic resistance organizations have already long established.
We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ms. Yang Healy.